One recurring attempt studios and producers have tried to get people to see their films on the big screen is 3D. It's an obvious gimmick, but we've seen audiences go from being excited about them to eventually getting tired of it. Even though some people associate the start of 3D films gaining popularity in the 50s, there were multiple tries going back to the silent era. There were some experiments here and there, but due to the technology at the time or lack of exhibitor interest, it was not something that took off. MGM was one studio that experimented with 3D in a couple of shorts produced by Pete Smith. The first of these, Audioscopics, which explains how 3D works, was even nominated for an Oscar. However, unlike sound and color, 3D did not change how films were made and released. With television becoming a competitor to movie theaters, studios sought ways to make the film-going experience more enticing. Naturally, 3D was seriously considered. One of these was the adventure film Wanna-Devil, released in 1952. Independently produced, the film came about because of Milton Gunsberg, a former screenwriter who developed a major interest in 3D. Shopping the idea of a 3D movie around Hollywood, he eventually attracted the attention of the makers of Wanna-Devil. Even though the movie was dismissed by critics, audiences responded to the film's gimmick. Probably the most well-known 3D movie of the 50s was House of Wax, starring Vincent Price. Ironically directed by a filmmaker who lacked the ability to see 3D images, the film had scenes like a paddleball jumping at the audience, and it was a sizable hit. Eventually, several other studios got into the mix, although many of their 3D films were usually more commonly exhibited traditionally. The musical Kiss Me Kate was one of the more notable 3D films, as was Creature from the Black Lagoon. Even Alfred Hitchcock got into the action with thriller Dial M for Murder. However, Dial M was also released around the time 3D was waning, and the few theaters which showed the movie in that format would quickly call Warner Brothers and ask for 2D print instead. Hitchcock would quip that 3D was a 9-day wonder, and he came in on the 9th day. Even though filmmakers like Hitchcock showed the format could be used in more than just adventure and horror movies, it did not take long for 3D to be considered a gimmick that did not add much to the overall experience, with the cheap glasses audiences had to wear not helping. While there were a few 3D films in the 60s and 70s, the format eventually returned to prominence in the 80s. Like in the 50s, it was popular with horror films like Friday the 13th Part 3. With 3D, they could have scenes of Jason Voorhees stabbing his victims and have his machete plunged towards the audience, although this film is probably more remembered for being the one that introduced his iconic hockey mask. In fact, it was the film's 3D effects supervisor who suggested the mask that would become Jason's signature. Friday the 13th Part 3 performed better at the box office than Part 2, so other horror sequels also decided to utilize 3D. One was Jaws 3D, which showed the shark swimming at the audience. Of course, when you make a film in 3D, you still have to fashion the film in a way where it will not look silly to audiences seeing it without the format. Jaws 3D fails that test, although it did not help how cheesy the special effects were. There was also the third Amityville movie, the science fiction film Space Hunter: Adventures in the Forbidden Zone, and the animated film Star Chaser: The Legend of Orin. Yet again, audiences tired of seeing 3D. In feature-length films anyway. 3D found a more fitting home in theme parks, especially Disney's. Disney recognized 3D as something that could enhance the immersive quality of their attractions. For example, Captain EO, a 17-minute Michael Jackson music video, used 3D as a major component. Directed by Francis Ford Coppola and partly conceived by George Lucas, Captain EO was well received by park guests, leading Disney to make other attractions in this format, like Muppet Vision 3D and Honey, I Shrunk the Audience. I'll never forget that moment in Honey, I Shrunk the Audience, where you see a bunch of rats scurrying under your feet. The Universal Studios theme parks also started showing 3D attractions, with James Cameron's T2 3D Battle Across Time becoming especially popular. Now almost any simulator or screen-based attraction at your typical amusement park will be in 3D. Where 3D also thrived was on IMAX. For while the format mostly showed documentaries and short films, and because of the size of the screen, 3D became a natural fit to immerse the audience even more into the environments. I saw the documentary Space Station 3D on IMAX, and it was an amazing experience, giving the feeling of being in outer space. That documentary opened in 2002 and has remained a fixture of IMAX screens since then. They stopped reporting the box office grosses shortly before the pandemic, but I would not be surprised if there are still a few IMAX theaters, science centers, or museums still playing that film. James Cameron is often credited for sparking the resurgence in 3D narrative feature films, but the director who I think really got the ball rolling was Robert Rodriguez. For the third Spy Kids movie, he chose to release it in 3D, and that became a big deal in the advertising. They even worked 3D into the story, with characters putting on glasses to enter a virtual video game world and battle the enemies. Critics panned the look of the film, saying the 3D made the colors look murky, but the target audience did not seem to mind, and became the highest-grossing Spy Kids movie. Rodriguez would do the same thing with The Adventures of Shark Boy and Lava Girl, which similarly did not get good reviews, and unlike Spy Kids 3D, was not a box office success. However, I think Spy Kids led to other studios taking another look at 3D. The Polar Express was one such film, which found a lot of popularity with its IMAX 3D presentation, which led to frequent re-releases. Disney played the animated films Chicken Little, Meet the Robinsons in select screens in 3D, and The Nightmare Before Christmas will get annual re-releases in 3D. Disney experienced particular success with the Miley Cyrus Hannah Montana concert film Best of Both Worlds. The film was intended to be seen in 3D, and because most theaters still do not have the proper projection equipment, it never played on more than 687 screens. Due to the hardcore Hannah Montana fanbase at the time, the concert film performed very well, even making $31 million on its opening weekend. Eventually, Pixar would release their first 3D film, Up, and the first two Toy Story films were converted and released in 3D to promote the then upcoming Toy Story 3. Jeffrey Katzenberg had a lot of faith in 3D and declared that all of DreamWorks Animation's films would be released in the format, starting with Monsters vs. Aliens. The stop-motion animated film Coraline also received a lot of attention for its use of 3D. What all of this was leading up to was James Cameron's Avatar. Cameron was a major champion of 3D done right and stressed the importance of using it to bring audiences fully into Pandora. When people went to see Avatar, they felt they had entered another world entirely. There were even reports of viewers disappointed they could not actually visit Pandora. Avatar was praised for understanding how to make 3D more than just a gimmick, and that was definitely one reason the film had such incredible staying power. That, and as Cameron has proven again and again, he knows what excites viewers when they go to see a movie in theaters. The humongous success of Avatar meant Hollywood decided 3D was the next big thing. Cameron was one of the first filmmakers to state the importance of using it responsibly and not just a way to inflate the grosses. Films like Avatar, How to Train Your Dragon, and Tron Legacy looked great in 3D because they were natively created and filmed that way. Even earlier films that were converted to 3D, like Toy Story and The Nightmare Before Christmas, knew they could not just slap on some extra dimensions and call it a day. Unfortunately, you had movies that were filmed in 2D and later post-converted, and this was usually obvious. A movie that received a lot of criticism from both critics and audiences was the remake of Clash of the Titans. After the success of Avatar, Warner Brothers had it post-converted to 3D, even though the release was only a few months away. And to those who paid the extra $3 to see it that way, they thought it looked really shoddy. I did not see Clash of the Titans, but I did see Tim Burton's Alice in Wonderland in 3D. That was also filmed in 2D, although the plan was always to have a 3D release, so it at least had more time to convert the film. And yet I was still underwhelmed with the presentation, which looked almost like watching cardboard cutouts at times. The movie that especially inspired me to try and avoid any post-converted films was Thor. It looked terrible and was more distracting than immersive. Admittedly, one thing that has improved is the glasses. Instead of those flimsy paper glasses with a blue and red lens, the real 3D ones provided by theaters these days look like sunglasses. Sometimes studios would consider converting a film and then decide against it in the end. Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 1 was originally intended to be released in 3D, but Warner decided against this, feeling there was not enough time. I'm guessing they learned a lesson from Clash of the Titans. When MGM had the distribution rights to the horror film The Cabin in the Woods, they considered converting it to 3D, which is strange considering how much of the film is set in the dark. When Lionsgate got the movie, the idea was dropped, much to the filmmaker's relief. 3D became such a focal point in the marketing too, with it usually touted as one of the big selling points. Despicable Me is a movie where I particularly remember them emphasizing that in the trailers, especially the roller coaster scene. Like I said, the best 3D was usually seen in the movies that were filmed that way. Martin Scorsese used 3D to enlarge the world inhabited by the characters in Hugo. It also fit thematically with the film, which was a celebration of what early cinema pioneers like George Méliès accomplished. However, that's the only 3D film Scorsese has directed, as he recognized it might not fit with something like The Wolf of Wall Street or Silence. Oddly enough, comedies that make fun of 3D also have an understanding of how to best use it. A very Harold and Kumar 3D Christmas mocked the sudden influx of 3D films, but the filmmakers nonetheless understood how to use the camera, and if you watch the film in 2D, the jokes still make sense. At a certain point, it did seem like most movies released in 3D barely did anything with it. There were 3D movies I saw where I would lift up the glasses at a few points, and the image was only slightly more blurry. The percentage of people going to see films in 3D dropped, as paying extra was just not worth it, and even theaters seemed to prefer showing the films traditionally. There are even movies I'm surprised to learn were in 3D. Did you know the James Bond film No Time to Die was released in 3D? I was very surprised when I learned that. It's not something the studios push that much in the trailers either, so they also recognize that the average moviegoer stopped caring. Fittingly, Avatar: The Way of Water was the first 3D movie in a long time where people made an effort to see it that way, and unsurprisingly it looked amazing. James Cameron knows what to do and what not to do when making a movie in 3D, and he's the last director who would dare try to make viewers underwhelmed by his presentation. Around 55% of its ticket sales were set to come from 3D showings, even though they generated about 8% of ticket sales in 2022. After the Avatar sequel became an enormous success, I did worry we would see a repeat of the early 2010s, with studios releasing quickly converted 3D films. However, that does not appear to have happened at all. Scream 6 was released in 3D, but you were far more likely to find showings in 2D. Barbie and Oppenheimer, two of the biggest films of the summer, did not get 3D releases, although Christopher Nolan frequently mentioned that he finds IMAX far more immersive than 3D, so the latter is not surprising. There will always be filmmakers who understand the best way to utilize 3D, and it has enhanced some movies. However, I'm not surprised people have again tired of 3D movies not directed by James Cameron. When you flood the marketplace with something that comes across like it was slapped together at the last minute, people will notice. And that's what happened with 3D movies this time. I'm sure we'll get a resurgence 20 years from now when the next technological breakthrough occurs. I think it's a fantastic format when used well, but I'm glad to only see it nowadays when absolutely necessary. See you next time.